For the first episode, looking at the various regions of FOCAR, we're going to be dealing with the Reef. And get rid of that border there. So the Reef is right here. This is a series of islands, an archipelago. Sorry, it is an archipelago series of islands and atolls, mostly just formed a little few volcanic, but a lot of it just formed through the process of coral and reef creation, making the atolls and filling in. Some of the larger items are volcanic, or even smaller ones might be extinct volcanic that have islands that have eroded away. The climate here is on par with Hawaii, and that's really kind of, as far as the climate goes, the basis here. You do have some drier parts, but all in large, we're dealing with stereotypical Hawaii. As far as the surface goes, I should say. So you're going to be having very lush land, and again, as I said, some different environments, of course, drier. Higher elevations will be possible. Some volcanic activity on the large island here, and maybe on the second largest island over here. But the main feature here is the atoll surrounding the small island in the center. And we're going to get more to that, but that's going to be the center of our civilization here. The civilization consists of turtles as well as tritons that have been driven from the rest of the sea by the Shahuagin. Now, the tritons were a much more powerful people originally, but they have been driven pretty much to here exclusively. There are few hiding out in the rest of the oceans, and you'll find some scattered throughout, just like you will anywhere. But by and large, this is the remaining tritons of FOCAR. And so if we put the cities on there, so apart from the capital here in the center, most of the surface is very rural. Most of the turtles who live on the surface live in single-family homes on a small plot of land. It dots the country. All these little homesteads dot the countryside, and they're largely self-sustaining. There's no real road network, rather a series of well-worn paths. Despite the relatively small size of the islands, it does take quite a while to get anywhere, since there aren't any beasts of burden or roads to travel on. Though this seems to suit the turtles fine, as they have a slower lifestyle than many of their contemporaries. And this is not to say intellectually by any means, but a more leisurely style of pace of life is the best way to describe that. The shores of the island are dotted with docks, and you're never more than a day away from one. Generally, you're not closer than a day away, and they're all kind of spaced out. They don't put more than they need, but you want to be able to get to a dock within about a day, maybe two. There are a few permanent structures at these places, and you'll be a place where you can come ashore if you're the tritons who live in the sea or the turtles who live on the land. It's a good meeting place. It's also a place where you trade goods. The locations will often have a building with open walls where travelers can stay. If there's space, you'll have like hammocks between the poles that support the roof. You're not generally too worried about the elements here. It's a very pleasant environment. And again, it's built by turtles who can just pull into their shell as well. There's also, if there's not enough room, it's not uncommon you'll see people camping outside. There is normally a general store where they'll have food, both like dried goods, seeds, things like that that turtle could take back to their home. But you'll also, it's like have a small place where you can eat there too. It's not going to be fancy by any means, as well as very basic supplies. I would say most of this wouldn't even have like the full adventure supply lists available to it. You're dealing more with like real general store type things. Yeah, there'll be some farm implements. Yeah, you might have a spear because a spear can be used for multiple purposes, but you wouldn't have a sword generally. And lastly, there will always be at least a signal fire. This is to warn of attack or to let people know that a market is happening. Sometimes the markets are planned and sometimes they are spontaneous. If a trade comes in that's particularly good, you'll let people know and they'll start to get, everyone will start to gather in that area. Excuse me. Of course, any other major event may be signaled this way too, and there's different smoke signals for those. Any disputes that happen, most of them are settled locally between the parties, or even just bringing in a third party that's right around there. Otherwise, they're taken to the capital. Underwater is a much more urban environment, and this is where the majority of the Tritons live. Driven to seek refuge here, they establish their homes around the island, seeking shelter from the Shahugan. As a result, the Tritons live in much denser communities than their Tortle neighbors. At first, these were rather squalid conditions close to the islands, but a few aquatic elves that were here combined their magic with techniques of the moon elves and found a way to grow coral, much like their moon elves grow stone to help form cities and buildings. The original camps have largely been abandoned in favor of moving to towns further out as they became more secure. Currently, there are 8 principal locations, with more being constructed in between. The eventual goal is to build all these towns up until they are connected to form a single megastructure that will act as a home and a wall to the outside seas, allowing those inside to be protected from the Shahugan. Along the surface, it would also theoretically provide more land for the Tortles. This is the most ambitious building project since the Cataclysm. The government of the Reef is a constitutional monarchy, though the constitution is unwritten. While welcomed into the area by the Tortles, the Tritons still strain at the slower pace of life in the Reef, rather than what their culture was used to. However, over the last 400 plus years, since their arrival, the two cultures have become more and more integrated, each adopting traits from the other. Not always good traits, not always bad traits, a real exchange. Always, we took the best that they had to offer and made it our own. Yeah, sometimes you took the worst, too. I wouldn't say the worst. It's pretty good, decent society here. The diets of the Reef is mainly plant-based, with protein coming from the sea and fish and other aquatic life or birds. The Tortles are careful to watch for invasive species of plant or animal, as they have experienced near environmental collapse before. This was for a couple of reasons. Some of it was their own doing, and this can be seen where the landscape is dotted with great stone heads that really signify this time. And this is very emblematic of an Easter island that has recovered from environmental collapse. So, but also some of it was not necessarily theirs. They do have the occasional problem with boar, as in pig, that have come here and messed up the environment as well. And think of almost like the rabbit in Australia. And so every once in a while, boar is always eaten. It's killed and eaten. It's always on the menu type of thing. If you see it, it's dead. But there's not very many left because they are very careful about it. As the reef needs to be self-sustaining as a whole due to the unreliability of trade with the outside world, the people here are very careful to prevent another collapse. The capital in the center is Leverath, It's the central hub and capital of the reef. It's a mixture of underwater buildings as well as continues above the surface. Most of it, let's get rid of the actual city icon there, is around the central hub here. So this part is actually cliffs that have been raised out. It was a caldera that kind of sank, and that's why it has that circular shape, and a cone reformed and has since gone extinct again. So you don't have an active volcano in the center of the capital. But so a lot of that is the city is built into that outer layer of the caldera, and so you have a lot of it's built into the rock itself and a little bit out from it, while around the water here in the center you do also have more buildings underneath, but most of it again is built around the top. And a lot of this, what the stonework, if you actually look at it, if it's not carved stone, the more recent construction is brick made from coral, grown using techniques acquired from elves that have allowed them to use this as a renewable building material, almost wood basically, but it's all coral. And so I'd say they're able to use that as the actual literal building blocks, not just underwater, but on top. Off to the north east here you have what's known as the wreckage. This is the remains of the Voltu, which is the colony ship that brought the dragons to Ethokar. The site is largely overgrown all the way up to the ship, but carefully maintained around it. It's seen as a historical relic, and so it's kept clear, but so it's also considered taboo to enter it without permission. So the ship is still there, relatively good condition, but no one goes in it, but they clean up around it, so nothing else gets into it either, whether plants or animals. The Forum is the center of government where laws are debated and passed. Once a month, the monarch must answer questions from the Forum, and once a month, the Forum must open to petitions from the public. Generally, these days take place 2 weeks apart from each other on average. So you'll have the monarch answering questions from the Forum, kind of Prime Minister question time in the British Parliament, and then 2 weeks later you'll have open petitions from the Forum, from the public. And because not everyone can do that and travel there, a lot of times they'll appoint their own unofficial representatives to go to their representatives and present their petitions. Excuse me. The palace, to an uninformed outsider, it will look, generally they'll look very disdainfully on the palace if they don't know what they're looking at. At first glance, it seems to be a very modest house that is built into the side of a cliff. Those lucky enough to be granted entry soon discover that this is really just the entry to it. Though many of the monarchs will use this entryway, and it does have some features of a modest house, they'll use it to greet visitors, so they don't need to bother with the trek into the deeper palace proper. So while some societies would want to show the grandeur of the Tortles are very much like, in the sense that, no, we're just here to meet with someone. We can do this in, a little sitting area that we have right here. However, the main palace is a series of small buildings inside a much larger cavern with wondrous plant life, groomed and maintained. Very much almost like if they put buildings in the Genesis cave from Star Trek II. Neha is the current queen and beloved by her people, and Prince Gare is next in line. And while recognized as not as wise as his mother, he's still young, And he does spend most of his free time taking in as much of his future kingdom as he can, and most of the people, while acknowledging that he's not ready for the throne, also look forward to his reign. So it looks very secure. The muster house is over here at the entrance to the city itself. It's a gap in the caldera where you can pass ships through. And the muster house is both a military headquarters as well as a main arms depot. The military here, you don't really have much of a distinction between the Army and the Navy. Everyone, the Turtles, the Triton can swim. To move around, you need the ships. It's very much largely a Navy with infantry. Admiral Seton is a Triton who is very devoted to the monarchy. Huge supporter, absolute loyalist. Has been an admiral for a while, and yet still is very much in awe of the monarchy. True fanboy. The Spire of Emos is the highest point on the reef, and it's a spire that has been carved. I'm sorry, not the highest point in the reef, but the highest point in the city, and is a spire that's been carved into a temple to the deity of wisdom. The Grove of Suris is one of the few flat spaces on the city and is devoted to an orchard of the deity of life. Suris is very popular among the Tritons as they are seen as having give the Tritons a second chance and a new home. Flotsam and Jetsam is a massive tavern that is partially built into the rock and is around about halfway up the inner piece of the city. And it's cobbled together both architecturally and in an interior design sense. There's always a show going on the stage. Sometimes it's very rowdy, and sometimes it's a very peaceful show, but there's always something going on. The sign outside the door is carved from driftwood. The letters, each individual letter spells out the name of Flotsam and Jetsam, and it floats back and forth kind of across the top of the door, very much as if it was caught in the tide going in and out. It does have room, so I guess it's an inn/tavern. It's run by Denise, who's a Triton, and her three daughters, Delamere, Koya, and Ebba. It's a very friendly and welcoming atmosphere. And then there's the Many Hands Emporium. It's a warehouse that collects goods from all over the reef and, when it can, beyond. It's run by Caddis, who's a turtle, who's an older turtle, very, very knowledgeable. He used to go around and collect all this stuff himself. Since he's older and not officially retired, but is retired from the collecting, and he sends his son Zale out to collect nowadays. And so Zale is almost always out. Just you have a ship, and it just goes from those little docks. Anything they have, they bring out to the ship. As soon as it's full, they go back to the warehouse, bring other things out if they're requested, and just basically is always out there collecting the goods. They do get a lot of drift from other places that is trade and collected, and of course the trade goods from within the reef itself. The towns along the outside there, leave that up. The town, it started with the 4 cardinal directions, and since have added the 4 ordinal directions. So north, south, east, west were the first 4. Northeast, southeast, southwest, northwest were the next 4 to be built. Work has begun on the 8 secondary intercardinal directions, north, northwest, things like that. Each town is named after the direction it is located in. The towns are initially laid out the same, but growth is then directed inward towards the center of the reef, since the eventual goal is to form a great barrier or wall that surrounds this whole place. So the whole archipelago will be surrounded by a reef, a great barrier reef of sort, or a great wall, whichever you want to call it. It's a combination really of both. And this is designed to keep the people of Reef protected, but also provide homes for the Tritons and more space for the turtles. The Cardinal towns have begun to develop their own personalities. Originally they're all laid out the same, just what direction they're facing basically is what's different. But they, as things grow and more organically after that, they've started to develop their own personalities. It's still relatively early days, though, in the scheme of building this giant mega city, mega structure, whatever you want to call it. The ordinals are very much still in the manufactured stage. There's not really much personality to them at this point. There are personalities in them, but the towns themselves don't really have their own personalities. And the inner cardinal are largely just plotted at this point. You have kind of the seeds for how they, the basis for how they start growing the coral and things like that laid out, and you have very temporary structures of the crews that are built, the construction crews that are building and growing this area. Regardless, there is a heavy military presence in all of these towns until the barrier is complete. So there's our first regional look. We will start going, I'm not sure where we'll end up next, but hopefully we'll stay on track with at least one of these a week.